Hi, this is Dr. Daresa, Assistant Professor of Theology at Concordia University, St. Paul. My presentation today is entitled, What Can the West Learn from the Rest? Nurturing the Culture of Global Conversation. Religious studies scholars and historians have been discussing about the shift of Christianity from global north to global south since the 1950s. 1970s in particular, a number of Western scholars such as Edward Norman, Andrew Walls, and Walbert Bohman recognized this phenomenon and have described the inevitability of Christianity going south. With his phenomenal book, The Next Christendom, Philip Jenkins also argued that the emerging Christian world will be anchored in the southern continent. Scholars such as Dana Robert, Lamin Sana, my good friend, and David Martin and others also joined the conversation and attempted to shift the attention of academic institutions and scholars to this new and emerging phenomenon, by which they described using the word the rebirth of Christianity. What caught the attention of these and other scholars was how fast this phenomenon has been happening in the last 70 years. At the beginning of the 20th century, for example, there were 60 million Christians living in our world. And a little over 70% of Christians during those times lived in the global north. During this time, Europe has served at the center of Christian thought and expression. However, over the last many decades, particularly after the Second World War, the European and American churches have continually been declining in number, while churches in a global south have experienced phenomenal growth and expansion. At present, over 60% or two-thirds of the Christian population lives in the global south. As the Australian scholar Mark Hutchinson described, what many thought in the 1960s as the days of the church through secularization turned out to be, quote unquote, relocation and rebirth of it into the rest of the world. There are two main points that are emphasized by those historians and scholars that describe or have been describing this phenomenon. First, with the shift of Christianity to the global south, a new and distinct form of Christianity has happened, a tradition separate from the Eastern and Western churches of historical times. Jenkins, for example, argued that the church in the global south have developed a distinct form of Christianity strictly on their own. He further argues that Christian church in the south are not just a transplant version of familiar religion of older Christian statues. The new Christendom is no mirror of the old, but is truly new developing entity. Walls likewise states that African Christianity, for example, should be understood as a new tradition comparable to Catholicism or Lutheranism or Orthodox Christianity in general. This is to argue likewise that the European scholar Walbert Bohman coined a term, third world theology or third world Christianity, similar to economic or political terms used by different scholars in our world today. Now, secondly, for these scholars, this new phenomenon has its own implication for the development of Christian theology and global Christian practices. Andrew Walls, for example, indicated 25 years ago that because of the shift of Christianity to the other part of the world, which means to the global south, The third world theology is more likely to be representative Christian theology. According to Walls again, African Christianity is the standard Christianity of the present age. He further predicted that the future general reader of Christian history is more likely to be concerned with Latin American and African and perhaps more Asian theology than that of European or American. In addition, now, in 2002, he further argued that the sign suggests that what Christianity of the 21st century will be like in its theology, its worship, and its effect on society, in penetration of new areas, whether geographically or culturally, will depend on what happens in Africa, in Latin America, and in parts of Asia. Now, my presentation today addresses the following questions. How are we to interpret or understand this new phenomenon? By this new phenomenon, I mean the shift of Christianity to the global south. And what is the implication of this new phenomenon for how we understand the Lutheran faith, practices, and tradition globally? And most importantly, how can scholars from both sides of the global community, both North and South, effectively nurture the culture of global conversation, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel as written in Philippians chapter 1, verse 27. The presentation also addresses two main problems that will be addressed when discussing about the significance of nurturing the culture of global conversation and mutual learning. The first is related to the problem with most scholars or Western scholars' insistence in describing Christianity as the Western religion. And secondly, the other problem addressed with this presentation is related to scholars in a global south describing themselves or churches in a global south as I am the future kind of thinking of themselves as the new or emerging center of Christian faith and describing the Western tradition scholarship which developed through many centuries as irrelevant to their context. So let me start with a quote from the book by Thomas Auden entitled How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind. Christianity would not have its present vitality in the two-third world without the intellectual understanding that developed in Africa between 50 and 500 CE. The pretense of studying church history while ignoring African church history is impossible. Yet this assumption has been common in the last 5 centuries of the shift of Christianity to the global south. As the Swiss scholar Wilbert Bohlmann rightly indicated in his writing, we are at the time when we are witnessing the coming of the third church. For Bohlmann, the Christian church history can be divided into 3 parts. The first 1,000 years under the domain of the Eastern Church, the era beginning with the second millennium, where the West became the center of Christian faith, and the present time, the third millennia, which began under the leadership of the third church, the Southern churches or Southern Christianity. He further emphasizes that the most important derives and inspiration for the whole church in the future will come from the third church. And what he refers to as the third church are the Christian churches in the global south. As Walls also indicated, Andrew Walls, the study of Christian history and theology will increasingly need to operate from the position where most Christians are at, and that will increasingly be the lands and islands of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific. 20th century, however, began with the Western world being the center of Christianity. And no one among the missionaries and scholars predicted that at the end of the century is going to be any different. When the Edinburgh Council, was held in 1910, Europe was 90% Christian and only 9.4% were African Christians. What one can understand from the conversation among the missionaries at the Edinburgh Council was that the missionaries had given up on Africa. Even though Asia was 2.4% Christian, a little less than Africa, missionaries had little hope that Asia might open their doors for Christian faith. Most missionaries predicted that Islam would take over most parts of Africa, and that the remaining would prefer to hold on to their traditional religions rather than embrace Christianity. The end of the century, however, was a surprise for not only the missionaries that predicted the opposite, but also historians and scholars that witnessed the shift of Christianity from the global north to south. 21st century began with 48% Africans identifying themselves as Christians and 9% Christians living in Asia. Christianity in Europe, however, began to decline steadily with less than 84% identifying themselves as Christians. In 2014, Latin America overpassed Europe and became a dominant or a continent with the most number of Christians. Few years later, Africa passed Latin America. In 2018, 599 million Christians lived in Africa, while 597 lived in Latin America. As Jenkins predicted, in 2002, the number of Christians in Europe continued to decline by 20%. Europe is now the third with 550 million Christians. Roughly speaking, at present, 2 of every 3 Christians live in the global south, with Africa and Latin America having become the continent with the largest number of Christians. According to Jenkins, in the coming 30 years, or by 2050, only about 1/5 of the world's 3 billion Christians will be non-Hispanic whites. According to the present statistics by Pew Research Center, only the United States and Germany are listed among the list of the top 10 countries with the highest number of self-identifying Christians. Brazil, Mexico, Russia, and the Philippines, Nigeria, China, and the Democratic Republic of Congo and Ethiopia fill the rest of the table. This is even without considering the fact that we might come up with a different number than this if we are to take into account active Christians as opposed to self-identifying Christians. It's not that difficult to observe that there are a large number of people attending the church in Africa and Asia than Europe. There are a large number of people attending the church in Addis Ababa, where I am from, or Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, or Seoul of South Korea than Rome, Wittenberg, and Germany, or Geneva. Look at these numbers. One can vividly observe the fact that the center of gravity is moving from European Christians or the European Christian core to the global south. So what resulted in such kind of growth in the global south is the question for us today. There can be multiple factors that resulted in such growth, as we can observe what is going on in Africa and Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, two of the main factors are the missional nature of the congregations and population growth. What I mean by missional nature of the congregations is the kind of commitment by Christians to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ to the non-believing communities. All members of congregations in the global south take the Great Commission seriously, that they actively participating in reaching out to the unreached communities. The other factor, of course, is associated with population growth. Christianity is presently growing only in parts of the world where population itself is growing. In 1900, for example, 25% of the world population was European, 60% Asian, and only 7% African. In 2000, this figure changed dramatically. Only 14% European, and that is including Russia, and 54% Asia, and Africans were at 10%. And today, that's a different story. We have 59.5% of the world population in Asia and 17.2% in Africa. Europeans are only 9.6% of the world population. By 2050, as predicted, Europe will comprise only 6% of the world population and Africa almost 22%. The growth of Christianity in Africa, Asia, and Latin America is therefore the result of population growth and Christianization of these continents as well. Likewise, the decline of numbers in Christians in Europe is the result of both a decline in European population and de-Christianization of Europe at the same time. So now, what do we make of these numbers? With regard to the projections about the future of Christianity, it's important to note that all these projections are estimations based on statistics. As Jenkins himself emphasized, statistics and projections related to matters of religious beliefs are sometimes notoriously unreliable. The only fact that we can learn from statistics is that the global south have more number of Christians than the global north, which for many scholars simply implies that Western Christianity is no more the defining center of the religion. However, what more can be said about the statistics rather than identifying or describing the shift of Christianity to the south? Now, for Jenkins, again, this shift of Christianity to the global south have major implications for the future of Christianity. What is expected next, according to him, is a period of mutual discovery among Christians of the three continents, like Africa, Asia, and Latin America, which, according to him, will result in an overarching unity and focus of royalty transcending mere kingdoms. With this unity, he argues, they will establish a new axis, which results in realignment of the center of Christian culture and tradition from the global north to the global south. Now, according to Jenkins, when that axis is established, we really would be speaking of a new Christendom based not only in not in the global north, but in the southern hemisphere. If what Jenkins predicted is true, then this growth of Christianity will eventually lead to the rise of a new Christian culture and tradition which emerged or is probably emerging in the global south. What is this new Christian culture like? And what does it mean for the global Lutheran community? If Jenkins and other scholars are right in that there exists or will exist or is emerging a new Christian tradition in the global south, which is distinct or different from the Eastern and Western churches of historical times, then how are we to understand the Lutheran churches in the global south, particularly in Africa and Asia, in light of this newly emerging phenomenon? Will we be experiencing a phenomenon whereby Africa becomes the center of Lutheranism, with distinct form of Lutheran tradition from the rest? Or, as asked in the Journal of Word and World in the summer of 1991 issue, this all will finally lead to wither Lutheranism. Now, I would like to discuss about the shift of Christianity and its implication for the African Lutherans or African Lutheranism. Now, as described above, the geography of global Christianity have changed quite dramatically over the past few decades. But few Lutherans in the global north, Western world, particularly North Africa, America, here in America, are aware of that. In the last 2 decades, as Lutherans in North America experienced a slow decline in number, Lutheran churches in the global south have continued to grow in large number. Now, at present, the Lutheran churches in Africa are one of the fastest growing churches in the world. There are 29 Lutheran bodies or Lutheran churches in Africa. And the Lutheran Church in Ethiopia, for example, the Ethiopian Evangelical Church Makani Jesus, is the largest Lutheran church in the world with over 10 million active members. There are more Lutheran members in Ethiopia than all Lutheran churches in America combined. And the total number of Lutherans in Africa exceeds those in Germany. Still, the country with the largest Lutheran population. When it comes to Asia, we find 47 Lutheran churches that are also growing in very large number. The largest of these churches is the Lutheran Church in Indonesia, the Protestant Christian Batak Church, which has over 4 million members. According to the membership data of the Lutheran World Federation, there are more Lutherans in Indonesia than there are members of the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, and Evangelical Lutheran Church in America combined. How will these churches shape traditional Lutheranism as they continue to confess Lutheran faith in the non-Western world or the non-Western culture? If we look at the Lutheran World Federation membership in 1988, the member churches had a combined membership of 54.9 million members. Of these, 18% lived in Africa, Asia, and South Africa, South America. Now, the Lutheran World Federation has registered 77 million members, whereby 22% live in Africa, 9% in Asia, and 6% in Latin America and the Caribbean. And altogether, 37% Lutherans live in the global south. Between 1988 and 2020, the Lutherans in Europe and North America declined in real number. By contrast, the number of Lutherans in the global south have shown more than triple growth, from 8.54 million in 1988 to 40 or over 40 million in 2020, gaining over 1 million members each year. So, what does this shift of Christianity or demographic shift imply? As stated earlier, according to some scholars, the demographic shift of Christianity to the global south will be accompanied by fresh theological reflections. In other words, this phenomenon creates an opportunity for southern Christians to shape or frame the future of Christianity. This would mean that the Lutheran churches in Africa and Asia will take the lead in shaping the future of Lutheranism. The question is, however, will this ever happen? Or for now, let's just assume that it is a possibility. Or if so, what is this new form of Lutheranism going to be like in the coming years? One possibility is that since the African culture and tradition resembles those of the biblical times more closely than do the Westerners, this might create an opportunity for African Lutherans or Asian or the Lutherans in the global south to lead the global Lutheran community towards a new and more biblical way of being a church. According to Jenkins, for example, the vast majority of non-Western Christians are more biblical than Western Christians. He states that they follow a literalist translation of the Bible. This is in contrast with the Northern Christianity or Western Christianity, which is, in his account, liberal in theology. Example that he provides is advocating for ordination of women and also they're liberal in morality, according to him. And the example that he gives on this regard is accepting homosexuality and normalizing divorce, and also advocating for abortion and use of contraception and so forth. Now, according to Jenkins, what helped churches in the global south grow in number is their conservative approach to Christianity. He argues that churches that are doing best in our world as a whole are the ones that stand furthest from Western liberal values or orthodoxies. Related to African Christians' emphasis on the Bible, one can also observe that they are also attracted to the abundant use of prophetic books of the Old and the New Testament. This is mainly because the great majority of Southern Christians, both Asians and Africans, really are poor and hungry and are persecuted and even dehumanized in so many different ways. As Christians experience poverty and and social, economic, and political oppression in its different forms, they find values in the prophetic books of the Bible, which is mostly absent from the 21st century Western Christianity. Therefore, now, according to Andrew Walls, this has led at times to situations whereby African, Asian, and Asian scholars were forced to work out some sort of Christian response to situations where Western theology provided no answer because those questions were irrelevant in the Western context. Therefore, the other possibility is that African or Asian Lutherans might take the lead in forming the future discussion about theological approach to economic, political, social, and ecological justice. Now, thirdly, the context in which Christians in the South formulate contextual theology is diverse communities, whereas the Christian tradition in the North or the Western world were largely shaped by the political and ecclesiastical structure of Christendom. Asian Christianity, for example, reflects on what it means to be minority religion in a pluralistic context, whereas Africans are more concerned about the compatibility of Christian faith with pre-Christian religious and cultural traditions. At this new age, when globalization and migration have brought our world together, Southern Lutherans could also take the lead in framing the discussion on theological conversation on how to do mission among diverse religious and cultural communities, or equip leaders with the ability to engage in cross cultural ministries. Now, finally, many congregations in America find themselves in lost and chaos of broken communities. This new world has confronted many of their held assumptions, and they don't know how to find order or identity in the midst of this chaos. The chaos has forced them to abandon their controlling structure and superficial identity and dig deep within themselves to find out the purpose and identity that really binds the church together. Therefore, the growing churches in the global south offers many helpful suggestions for how to dance between order and disorder, as well as how to see chaos and change as or ally rather than an enemy. Now, back to the main question related to my presentation today. Can the West learn from the rest? With the center of gravity shifting to the global south, many leaders and scholars expect to see the rise of new voices and fresh theological reflections from the non-Western world. They also expect to see Southern Christians assuming leadership in international organizations that their numbers would seem to suggest. The reality, however, is that even though the number of Christians have been declining for decades in the Northern world, the Northern church's influence on others have continued. Theological institutions in the global south are still, for most part, dependent on Northern scholarship. When it comes to the global leadership in the world institutions such as World Council of Churches, Lutheran World Federation, World Evangelical Churches Alliance, and so on are still predominantly under the leadership of the Westerners. However, this dominant tradition seems to have been changing slowly in the last few decades. One can observe that the decline in membership had its own impact or implication on the gradual decline of the leadership of Northern churches at the global scale. Among the Pentecostals, for example, most revival movements in the 21st century or in the 20th century were led by whites or white Caucasians. Whereas in the 21st century, these movements are taken over by the non-white from the global south. With the flow of large number of immigrants to Europe and America, leaders of these revival movements are also having large influence in the Western world. Often, churches that are growing in the West are led by these immigrant churches. The global influence of Southern Christians is the witness in what Jenkins in his book refers to as reverse mission from majority world back to the West. Taking example of an African church or congregation in Amsterdam, Netherlands, he argues that this one congregation that he mentioned in his book probably represents the future face of Christianity in the Western world. He further argues that for the next few decades, the face of religious practices across the face of Europe would be painted in brown or black color. Jenkins' argument is supported by many scholars who discussed about the role of diaspora people in evangelism to the West. Publication of a volume by a theologian from Sierra Leone And professor of world history at Emory University by the name Jehu Ensilas, and his book is entitled Beyond Christendom, is one good example. In his work, Eselius states that every African Christian immigrants considers every place of residence as a mission field. Furthermore, when we look at the past few decades, there have been new and emerging Christian scholarship in the South, both Lutheran and non-Lutherans. These newly emerging voices and theological expressions arise as leaders and theologians in the South continually attempt to respond to critical issues in their context. The fundamental question, however, is whether the global Lutheran community is engaging, critiquing, or even investigating these theologies in light of the scripture and Lutheran confessions so that they can find their place in the global Lutheran landscape. Another question related to this is whether there is a place for these emerging southern voices in the dominant culture of Western scholarship. Are Western scholars ready to listen, engage, and learn from others? As Jenkins observed, the Northern scholars and church leaders are not ready to learn or engage others because they are not taking the rise of Christianity in the global South into a serious account. They have not only overlooked or have given little value to this new phenomenon, but have also continued with their description of Christianity as Western religion. According to Jenkins, Western Christianity rarely gives South anything like the attention it deserves. But when they do notice it, they tend to project on it their own familiar realities and desires. He further argues that time and time again, when European and American Christians look south, they see what they want to see. So, as described above now, as I stated earlier, few scholars like Jenkins and Andrew Walls and others have tried to introduce their own conception of global history of Christianity into debates. Majority of Western scholars, however, still follow Eurocentric reading and investigation of Christian history, a Christian history which appears to begin and end with Western Christianity. For many decades, they have generally been treating Christianity in other parts of the world as an appendix to the history of European Christianity. The Christian faith that existed outside the Western Hemisphere is being generally understood and described as what has been brought there by Western missionaries. However, this Eurocentric reading of Christian history neglects the fact that Christianity existed in the global South beginning patristic time, maybe even before that in the case of Ethiopia and Egypt. That Christianity existed in Asia before the arrival of Western missionaries. After Christianity began in Near East, Christianity was mainly spread throughout North Africa and Asia. In the first and second century, Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, and Mesopotamia were considered as the center of Christianity. Tunisia, in particular, was the home of great church fathers such as Cyprian, Tertullian, and Augustine, the three main theologians who laid the foundation for the Western theology to emerge as it did. Already by the second century, Egypt and North Africa were also part of the Christian Roman Empire, playing major role in the formation of global Christian theology. Now, quoting Andrew Walls, African Christianity was established not only before the white people came or before the missionaries arrived, but before Islam came to Africa. And Christianity has existed continuously in Africa for longer than it has in Scotland, and infinitely longer than it has in the United States. African Christianity today can assert the right to the whole history of Christianity in Africa, stretching back almost to the apostolic age. And on the other hand, according to one of the European scholars named Fans Wheatstone, the other reason why the Western Christians may not learn much from the rest of the world, especially the global South, is mainly because they can't simply return to the pre modern values. He argues that Christian ideas entertained by scholars and church leaders in the global South are pre modern, pre Enlightenment values that contradict with the Western, modern, or postmodern worldviews. Therefore, according to Whitson, the only way that the West can learn from the rest is if the two are able to adapt a new hermeneutic principle that he refers to as transmodern hermeneutic, a hermeneutic method which, according to him, can help the Southern Christians transcend the pre modern values. This is in reaction to Philip Jenkins' argument that Christians in the global South are far more conservative in terms of both belief and moral teaching. Now, besides the Southern churches being conservative, for again Whitson, what constitutes pre-modern or pre-enlightenment values in the Southern Christianity is their emphasis on the supernatural experience. As Jenkins also described, Christianity in the global South is mostly traditional, orthodox, and supernatural. According to him, all Christians, regardless of their denomination, favor prophecy, faith healing, exorcism, and dreaming and vision and so forth. For Christians in the South, such practices are part of their everyday reality. They believe in the objective existence of evil spirits and the necessity for Christians to free people from the works and domination of those spirits. Gospel texts that talks about Jesus healing the sick, casting out demons, and performing other signs and wonders are central to their ministry, even though such passages are seen by Western churches as marginal, symbolic, and purely historical in nature. For some Western scholars, Southern Christianity is a creation of the Western missionaries, and therefore nothing new to learn from them. In other words, there isn't much to learn from the Southern Christianity since it's a duplicate of Western Christianity. This assumption is founded on the role of Western missionaries in the spread of Christianity in the global South. In recent scholarship, however, in response to such wrong or erroneous conclusion, some have started to emphasize the role of indigenous missionaries in the spread and development of Christianity in the South. Scholars such as Steed and Sandler, for example, argues that it was indigenous missionaries who couldn't keep the discovery for themselves, the discovery of the gospel for themselves, but took the message to others so that the message could spread as rings and on the water. Walls also rightly argues that all the great movements toward the Christian faith in Africa and even Asia have been led by indigenous missionaries. The question is, however, if the indigenous missionaries played a major role in the growth of Christianity in the global South, what was the contribution of Western missionaries? According to Lamin Sana, the Christian tradition in the South should be described as indigenous response rather than extension of churches from the Western world. The work of missionaries that contributed greatly to the growth of Christianity was their priority to translate the Bible into local languages, which, according to Sana, has resulted in the development of literacy in each culture and empowerment of indigenous leaders. According to Sana, now I'm going to quote him here, Christian missions are better seen as a translation movement with consequences for vernacular revitalization, religious change, and social transformation. Similarly, Jenkins also argues that Christian church in the South are not transplanted version of the similar religion of the older Christian statue. He further argues that Southern churches have already developed a distinct form of Christianity strictly on its own terms. For him, Christian faith in the South is a new form of faith distinctly being formed and developed. Again, what is not answered clearly in Jenkins' writings is what this new form of Christianity is like. How is this new form of Christianity strictly African or Asian or Latin American? And what does this mean for Lutheran churches in the South? Coming back to the question whether the West is ready to learn from others, one needs to discern what the relationship will be like for the future between churches in the South and the North. Will this shift of Christianity to the South awaken the Western Christian and also gravitate them towards mutual dialogue and partnership in mission? Or will the West remain isolated and continue with its previous tradition? Or as Jenkins predicted, based on the work of Samuel Huntington, which he somehow disagreed with at some point, this demographic shift will result in a clash between Christians in the North and South. According to Jenkins, the awakening among Christians in the South may eventually lead to revolt against any form of Western domination. This, of course, was also discussed over half a century ago by Hendrik Kramer and Max Wern. Rather than predicting the possibility of conflict, how about if we work together for global conversation and openness to forming partnership for making greater impact in our world today? And this is the main emphasis of my speech or presentation for today. As far as I know, Christians in the global South are globally engaged at present time. Brazil, Korea, and Nigeria are sending a large number of missionaries globally. The Lutheran churches in Africa have also been doing the same for the last few decades. The sentiment that Christian mission flows from the West to the rest has changed. With this change happening, what are the Western churches to do? In fact, according to Robert Woothrow, in his book entitled Boundless Faith, Global Outreach of American Churches, there are many American churches who have already forged partnership with the South and are engaged in faster and more efficient transcultural or intercultural communication, interacting with a sizable population of refugees and immigrants, and contributing to a large-scale international humanitarian and relief organizations. Now, finally, I would like to turn to the question whether we can nurture the culture of global conversation between the West and South. In addition to demographic shift discussed so far, we are witnessing the fact that because of globalization, our world today is connected more than ever. Media and migration have changed the face of the world. With these changes, God seems to have provided our churches with the opportunity to move beyond their comfort zones, limited territories, and impact the world the way they have never done that before. So why not embrace this great opportunity? The church in the 21st century needs to recognize this opportunity and its responsibility to stand with its partners and face the challenge of this postmodern time. I personally argue that Lutheran churches in particular should opt to do mission in partnership with openness with global partners. Some probably assume that such openness will lead to a compromise on their side with regard to their theological positions. However, it's only where openness take precedence that true dialogue and mutual learning occur. A stance that could also help all churches involved, particularly confessional Lutheran churches, to assist their partners in coming to what they consider to be the right understanding about the scripture and Lutheran confessions. Such dialogue and mutual learning will particularly benefit not only Western churches or American Lutheran churches, but the growing Lutheran churches in Africa and Asia. But the question is again, is there anything that the Western churches can learn from the Southern churches if such mutual dialogue and partnership occur? And the other most important question is if the West is ready to engage in such partnership. But if the West or the American Lutheran churches decide to engage in such partnership and mutual dialogue, the most important lesson that they can learn from Christians in the global South is their emphasis on local and global mission, which is the proclamation of the gospel by all Christians to all people. This proclamation is our response as Christians to the Great Commission of Jesus Christ, which is stated in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. What I have come to understand after living in the United States for the last 10 years and visiting European countries 9 years ago is a sense of the proclamation of the gospel is not as strong as it is in the Southern or among the Southern Christians. African Lutherans, for example, are committed in engaging their community with the gospel. Women in particular are the ones that play a major role in creating social networks and small prayer and Bible study groups through which they witness Christ to the people in their communities. And the other thing that the Western churches could learn from Southern churches is how they address the wholeness of life in their theology and ministry. In the Western world, theology shaped by secularism has mostly been a matter of mind that failed to address the wholeness of life as we see it in the Gospels. The Christians in the global South, on the other hand, are notoriously religious people who do not distinguish between the sacred and the profane because they view life as a whole. They put faith at the center of the religious, social, economic, and political life. And religion permeates into all departments of life so fully that it is not easy or possible always to isolate it. Therefore, in this part of the world, the global South, religion is part of all kinds of academic and non-academic discourse, which is different from the Western form of Christianity that creates clear boundary between the physical and the spiritual. To give example, most Lutheran churches in the South have been involved in the struggle against poverty and lack of democracy. They've also been playing important role in addressing issues such as climate change and global epidemics such as HIV/AIDS and so forth. For them, God's mission is holistic. The gospel of Jesus Christ is proclaimed to address both the spiritual and the physical aspect of life. Finally, coming to my conclusion, given the striking shift that is happening globally, it's time for the global Christian community to respond together thoughtfully. They need to think together about how this demographic change will impact the Christian community or the Christian ministry in theology. For this to happen, the Western Academy needs to start to think more globally. Leaders of the Christian communities need to reflect on how they might respond to missionary works in this new global age. Thank you for listening, and I'll look forward for our discussion afterwards.